The applause in that banquet hall was so loud it bounced off the ceiling and came back down like a wave. I remember watching my son stand up there at the podium, microphone in hand, his new suit catching the light from the chandeliers overhead, and I thought, this is the moment. This is what I worked for. Every double shift, every skipped meal, every holiday I spent alone while he studied in another state. I sat at that table with my hands folded in my lap and my heart so full I could barely breathe. I was wrong about what was coming next. But to understand what happened that night at the Riverside Grand Hotel in Columbus, Ohio, you have to understand where we started. You have to understand what it means to build a life out of nothing, with a child on your hip and a man who stopped caring long before he stopped pretending. My name is not important. What matters is that I was 63 years old when my son stood in front of 400 people and introduced me as the woman who used to clean his apartment. Let me take you back. I was 31 when I had my son. His father and I had been married 6 years by then, and for the first 2 of those years, I actually believed we had something real. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming only in public, only when it costs them nothing. At home, he was cold. Not cruel with his fists, but cruel with silence. Cruel with the way he could look right through me like I was a window and not a person. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it would get better when we had the baby. It did not get better. When my son was 4 years old, his father sat down at the kitchen table one Tuesday evening and told me he was leaving. No argument, no affair that I knew of at the time. He just said he had met someone who made him feel more like himself. Those were his exact words. Someone who makes me feel more like myself. I remember staring at the pot of macaroni on the stove and thinking that I had spent 6 years making myself smaller so he could feel larger, and apparently it still wasn't enough. He left with his suitcase and a box of his records. He left me with a 4-year-old, a mortgage I couldn't afford alone, and exactly $847 in a checking account. I will not pretend those first years were anything other than brutal. I worked as a medical billing specialist during the day and waitress 3 nights a week at a steakhouse off Route 40. My sister would watch my son on the nights I worked late. I drove a 1994 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on the passenger side. I wore the same 4 pairs of work shoes in rotation until the soles separated. I never once complained about any of this in front of my son, because I had decided early on that my hardship would not become his burden. His father reappeared when my son was about 7, not as a father, as a shadow. He would call occasionally, send birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside, show up for a weekend here and there and act like a hero. My son adored him for it. Children are like that. They love the person who shows up with balloons more than the person who shows up at 6 a.m. every morning to pack a lunch. I never said a bad word about his father. Not once. I believed that was the right thing to do. Looking back, I wonder if I was protecting my son or protecting the version of myself that needed to believe I was the bigger person. The divorce settlement gave me the house, which sounds like a victory until you realize the house needed a new roof and the furnace was on its last legs. I refinanced twice in 10 years just to keep up with repairs. Every time I thought I had gotten ahead, something would break, or my son would need something: new cleats for soccer, a school trip to Washington, D.C., a laptop for his freshman year of high school. I never said no. I never wanted him to feel the gap between himself and the kids whose fathers were still around. When he was 16, he told me he wanted to be a physician's assistant. He had been volunteering at the hospital on weekends, shadowing a family friend in her practice, and he had found his calling. I sat on the edge of his bed that night while he explained his plan, and I cried after I left his room. Not from sadness, from something that felt like relief, like all of it had been worth it. I started saving differently after that. I opened a separate account, and I put money in it every single month like it was a bill I owed. When my own mother passed and left me a small inheritance, $42,000, I put nearly all of it in that account. When my company offered an early retirement buyout, I took the lump sum and invested most of it. I told myself I was building a bridge for my son to walk across. He got into a PA program in Charlotte, 2 years of graduate coursework after his bachelor's degree. The program cost, between tuition, housing, and living expenses, just over $90,000. His father contributed $6,000 over the 2 years. I covered the rest. My son knew where the money was coming from. He would call me after a hard week of clinical rotations and say, "Mom, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you make this possible." And I would tell him that he was worth every penny. I want you to understand something about that time in my life, because I think it matters for what came later. I was not a saint. I was a tired woman in her mid-50s who had been running on adrenaline and determination for 20 years. I had been diagnosed with a heart arrhythmia 2 years before my son started graduate school. Nothing immediately dangerous, the cardiologist said, but something that required monitoring and medication and would require an ablation procedure if it worsened. I had not told my son about this because I did not want anything to distract him from his program. He graduated in May of that year with honors. I drove 9 hours to Charlotte by myself because I did not want to ask anyone to come with me and then feel obligated to entertain them. I sat in the front row of the auditorium in the dress I had bought on sale at Macy's 6 weeks earlier, and when they called his name, I stood up and I clapped until my hands ached. At dinner afterward, his father showed up. He had not been to a single clinical rotation presentation, had not attended one graduation ceremony for the bachelor's degree, had not called on one birthday in the past 4 years. But he showed up to this dinner with a woman I had never met, younger than me by about 15 years, highlighted hair, a laugh that carried across the entire restaurant. He clapped my son on the back like they were old friends. He ordered champagne for the table. My son lit up like a lantern when his father walked in. I told myself I wasn't hurt by that. I told myself that my son loving his father did not diminish what we had. I drove home the next morning with the windows down and the radio loud so I wouldn't have to hear my own thoughts. The following 18 months were the happiest I had seen my son. He got a position at a cardiology practice in Columbus. He found a nice apartment. He started dating a woman, I'll call her his girlfriend, who had grown up in an affluent suburb of Cleveland and who had never, as far as I could tell, gone without anything in her life. She was not unkind to me. She was something more slippery than unkind. She was pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they have already decided you are not particularly relevant. I noticed things changing slowly. My son would call less frequently. When I visited, he seemed distracted, checking his phone, glancing toward the door. Once, during a visit, his girlfriend made a comment about the neighborhood where I lived, not mean exactly, but with that particular tone that makes an observation feel like a verdict. My son laughed. A small laugh, more of a reflex than a choice, but I heard it. I had my ablation procedure that November. Outpatient, technically, but I was alone in the recovery room for 3 hours afterward because the friend I had asked to drive me had an emergency with her own family. I texted my son from the recovery bed. He called the next morning and apologized for not calling sooner. He said he hadn't realized I was actually having the procedure that day. I said it was fine. I had said that word so many times in my life it had lost almost all of its meaning. In February, my son called to tell me that he and his girlfriend were being recognized at a gala. The hospital foundation was honoring several young healthcare professionals in the region, and my son was one of them. The event was black tie. It was being held at the Riverside Grand in Columbus. He said he wanted me there. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I felt proud, yes. But I also felt something sharper, a kind of desperate hopefulness. Like maybe this would be the night when everything that had gotten quiet between us came back to life. I bought a new dress. I got my hair done. I drove the 2 hours to Columbus alone and checked into the hotel where the event was being held because I had promised myself I would not be the mother who showed up tired and rumpled to her son's big night. The gala was exactly what you might imagine. Round tables with white linens, a string quartet during cocktail hour, a silent auction along the far wall. I found my seat, table 11, toward the back of the room and waited for my son. He came in with his girlfriend on his arm, already working the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. He saw me from across the space and waved. Not the wave of a son who is glad to see his mother, the wave of a man acknowledging an acquaintance before returning to more important things. His father arrived 20 minutes later. Same woman, same energy. They were seated at table 3, near the front. The program began after dinner. There were 5 honorees, and my son was introduced last. He walked to the podium to a long round of applause, and I will give him this, genuinely moving for the first part of his speech. He talked about his commitment to patient care. He talked about what it meant to work in cardiology. He thanked his girlfriend. He thanked her parents, who were seated at table 3 next to his father. He thanked his father for showing him what it meant to work hard and build something from nothing, and I heard my father's voice in my head from years ago saying, "Every person writes their own history." I had not understood what he meant when I was young. Then my son said he also wanted to thank the people who had helped him in smaller ways along the road. And he looked directly at table 11 at me and he said, "And I want to acknowledge the woman who cleaned my apartment all through grad school and kept me sane. She is here tonight. She is like family to us." The room offered a polite murmur of appreciation. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I sat with my hands in my lap and my face completely still, because somewhere in the part of my brain that handles emergencies, a very calm voice said, "Do not let them see you come apart." He had not called me his mother. He had not said my name. He had described me, to 400 people in a ballroom in Columbus, Ohio, as a woman who cleaned his apartment. The girlfriend was looking at her phone. His father was refilling his champagne glass. No one at my table knew who I was, so no one reacted. The string quartet began playing again, as the MC moved to closing remarks. I picked up my clutch. I folded my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. I stood up slowly, the way you stand when your legs are not entirely cooperating but your dignity requires that nobody notice. I walked to the coat check. I retrieved my coat. I walked through the lobby of the Riverside Grand and out through the revolving door into the February air, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold hit my face. I did not cry. I had used up whatever tears belonged to this particular wound a long time ago, in other forms, in other moments. What I felt was something quieter and more final than grief. I drove back to my hotel room. I sat on the edge of the bed in my new dress and I took out my phone and I looked at the 3 photographs I had framed on my dresser at home, my son at age 5 missing his 2 front teeth, my son in his high school graduation cap, my son hugging me the day he got his acceptance letter. And I thought about all the nights I had sat on the edge of another bed, in another town, telling myself that it would mean something, that it was building towards something. I want to tell you what I did not do. I did not call my son that night. I did not send an emotional text message. I did not post anything. I did not call his father or his girlfriend or anyone connected to that world. I took off my dress. I hung it in the closet. I took 2 of my heart medication. And I slept. In the morning, I drove home. I spent the next 2 weeks thinking with great care. I am not an impulsive person. I have never made a decision in anger that I was not prepared to live with, because I have seen what that looks like. I was married to a man who lived by impulse and watched him hollow out everything he touched. So I waited. I thought. I was methodical. My son called on a Thursday, 11 days after the gala. He said he hoped I had enjoyed the event. He asked how the drive home had been. He did not mention what he had said at the podium. I listened to him talk about a difficult case he'd had at the practice, about a trip he and his girlfriend were planning to Portugal. I said very little. When he asked if everything was okay, I told him I had some things I needed to take care of. The first thing I did was call my financial advisor. I had a will that named my son as the primary beneficiary of my estate, the house, the remaining retirement accounts, a life insurance policy I had maintained for 30 years. I changed the beneficiaries. The house would go to my younger sister. The life insurance would be split between 2 charities I had supported for years. The retirement accounts would be distributed to my sister and a close friend who had shown up for me in ways my son had not. The second thing I did was go through my files and pull out every document that told the story of what I had given, the bank statements showing the transfers to his tuition account over 2 years, the receipts from the apartment deposits I had covered, the medical bills from my own procedures that I had paid out of pocket because I was spending down my savings on his education and couldn't maximize my own coverage. I did not intend to use these documents as weapons. I wanted them for myself. I needed to see it laid out plainly, without the softening that memory applies to sacrifice. The third thing I did was write my son a letter, not an email, a letter, on paper, in my own handwriting. I told him exactly what had happened at the gala from my point of view. I told him what it had cost me to be in that room. I told him what it had cost me, in total, over the entire arc of his life, not to make him feel guilty, but because I realized I had spent 30 years protecting him from information that was actually his to carry. I told him that I forgave him, because I needed to do that for myself and not for him. And I told him that forgiveness was not the same thing as continuing on as we had been, and that I would need him to decide for himself what kind of son he wanted to be going forward. I mailed it on a Tuesday. I did not follow up. He called 4 days later. He was upset in the way that people are upset when they have been caught, not in the way that people are upset when they have genuinely understood what they did. He said he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. He said I was being dramatic. He said his girlfriend had pointed out that I had always been difficult, and that maybe this was a pattern. I let him finish. Then I said, quietly and without any particular emotion, I know what you meant, and I know what you've been told to mean. And I love you enough to tell you that those two things are not going to be your inheritance from me. He was silent for a long time. I told him I was not cutting him out of my life. I told him I was not his enemy, and I was not interested in a war. But I was 63 years old with a heart condition and a finite amount of time and energy, and I was done spending either one of them trying to make myself small enough to fit into the version of his life where I was the woman who cleaned his apartment. I heard him start to say something, and then stop. I asked him to think about what he actually valued, not what he had been conditioned to perform in front of certain people. I told him that if he ever wanted to talk honestly, not to manage me, not to smooth things over, but to actually talk, I would be there for that. And then I told him I loved him, and I said goodbye, and I hung up. I will not lie to you and tell you that was easy. I sat by the phone for about 20 minutes afterward, feeling like I had just released something from my hands that I had been carrying so long, the weight had stopped feeling like weight. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from finally telling the truth about what you lost a long time ago. My son did not call again for 6 weeks. I did not chase him. I used that time in ways that surprised me. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I had talked about doing for 15 years and never done. I called friends I had neglected. I drove down to Georgia to spend a week with my sister, who had been asking me to visit for 3 years, and we sat on her porch in the evenings and talked in the way that only sisters can, where half the meaning is in what you don't need to say. I had a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist in late spring. She told me my numbers had improved. She asked what I had changed. I said I had stopped carrying something very heavy. When my son finally called that 6th week, his voice was different. The managed quality was gone. He sounded younger, somehow the way people sound when they've been doing hard thinking and have come out the other side, not with answers but with better questions. He told me he had gone back and listened to the recording from the gala. One of the tables had videoed the ceremony and posted it online, and a mutual acquaintance had sent it to him with a message. He said he had watched himself say it. He said hearing it from the outside was different from how it had sounded in his head at the time. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything for a moment. He said he had been trying to understand, and he thought part of it was that he had spent years building an identity around his success, and in that story, he had unconsciously rewritten the beginning, made himself self-made, given his father more credit than his father had earned, because it was easier to have a heroic father than to sit with the complicated truth of what his father actually was. And that putting me in the position of the cleaner, he said it with difficulty, like the word cost him something, was a way of keeping me in a supporting role in a story where he was the hero. I told him that was probably the most honest thing he had ever said to me. He asked if we could start over. Not pretend the past hadn't happened, but start from where we actually were. I told him that was what I had been waiting for him to ask. We did not return to what we had been. I will be honest about that. The version of us that existed before that night in Columbus is gone, and I don't believe it should come back, because that version required me to be invisible in order to function. What we are building now is something different, slower, more careful, more honest. He visits every couple of months and we cook dinner together, and sometimes we talk about the hard things and sometimes we don't. His girlfriend and I are not close, and I have accepted that we may never be, but he does not let her speak about me the way she once did. I know this because he told me, directly, that he had that conversation with her. That was worth more to me than any apology. His father called me once, about 4 months after everything. I'm not sure what he expected, maybe the version of me that had always absorbed his nonsense graciously. I let the call go to voicemail. He left a message that was 12 seconds long and said something about hoping there were no hard feelings. I saved the voicemail for about a week and then deleted it and have not thought about it much since. I am not telling you this story because I want you to feel sorry for me. I have had enough of people's sorrow. What I want is for you to hear the part that comes after the worst night, because the worst night is not where the story ends unless you let it. I turned 64 last October. My sister flew up from Georgia and we went to dinner at a restaurant I had always wanted to try and could never justify the cost. I ordered the salmon and a glass of wine, and I sat at a table by the window while the October light came through the glass and laid itself across the tablecloth. My sister raised her glass and said, "Here's to the woman who stopped waiting for permission to live her own life." I laughed, genuinely laughed, and I thought about the version of myself who had driven home from Charlotte after a graduation dinner and cried with the radio turned up loud. I want to tell that woman something. I want to tell her that the people who cannot see your worth are not the authors of your value. I want to tell her that there is a version of your life waiting on the other side of the thing you are afraid to say. I want to tell her that forgiveness is real and it is powerful and it does not require you to hand anyone back the keys to your life. I have changed my will back partially. I included my son in it again, at a lower percentage, because I believe in who he is becoming more than I believe in who he was. But the larger portion still goes to my sister and the causes I care about. Not as punishment, as honesty, as a record, in the only legal language we have, of who actually showed up. The watercolor class meets every Thursday morning. Last week I painted a cardinal on a bare branch winter red against a gray sky, and when I brought it home and put it on my wall, I stood in front of it for a long time. It is not a perfect painting. The branch is slightly crooked and the proportions are a little off. But I made it with my own hands in my own time for no reason other than that it brought me something. And some mornings when I walk past it on my way to make coffee, it looks to me like a very small, very stubborn proof of something. That proof is mine. If you are watching this from a place I recognize, if you are the person who has given everything and been told it amounts to nothing, I want you to hear me say this clearly. You are not the cleaner. You are not the supporting role. You are not the woman in the back of the room at table 11 who can be summed up in a sentence and moved past. You are the whole story. And you are allowed to act like it.